For many business studies students, those longer evaluative questions are their absolute Everest. So in this video, we're going to try and teach you a really simple technique so that you can maximize your marks when you're doing those 16 to 20 mark questions. So let's be clear, there is no one set way that you have to write 16 to 20 mark essays. The exam board very deliberately haven't released a structure that they expect students to use when they're writing longer answers. That said, we're going to show you a formula today that's tried and tested and proven to work. However, if this contradicts anything that you've been told by your tutors, do not panic. The most important thing in a 16 to 20 mark essay is to show the examiner the 4 key skills that they are looking for, namely knowledge of the topic in the question, application throughout, applied chains of analytical impacts, and evaluative comments and judgments. If you show those 4 skills, you will be golden. But if you are looking for a simple, effective structure for your 16 to 20 mark essays, then let's give you the rundown. Before we even get going on a 16 to 20 marker, we should already have read that question. We should read the question before we even start reading any stimulus material so that we know what kind of points to look out for in the case studies. One thing to watch out for in those 16 to 20 mark questions are those questions that are quizzing you on dual topics so that there's 2 elements to the question. We have an example of this on the board behind us here, and we can see how in this question they're really trying to quiz you on 2 different elements, and if you miss that second element when you're answering the question, your answer is going to be a little bit off topic. So this question is, do you think retailers such as Debenhams and ASOS now need to focus more on place rather than other elements of the marketing mix? And for some students, that will be as far as they read, and they will then embark on a question all about whether place is the most important element of the marketing mix or whether it's one of the other 6 elements. What they've done is they've missed that second part of the question, and that second part is crucial. We want to know whether place is the most important element of the marketing mix if we are trying to increase our market share. Now that gives a slightly more nuanced context to that question that we've got to try and weigh up and evaluate. And so often we see students get carried away in the heat of battle and they plow into the question because they think they've got the gist of it. Is place the most important element of the marketing mix? And they've ignored that dual aspect, that second part of the question. So that's something to watch. Now let's move on to timings, because when we're doing those 16 to 20 mark questions, the timings of them can make or break the rest of our exam. If we spend too long on a 16 to 20 mark question, we might find ourselves in the disastrous position where the invigilators are ending the exam and we've still got questions that have gone unanswered. So your classic rule is to try and spend a minute on a question for every mark that it's worth. So if it's a 16 marker, 16 minutes. If it's a 20 marker, you get the system. However, it may be possible to try and rob some time from other questions in the exam and just apportion them over to those 16, 20 mark questions where we know we've got to show more depth, we've got to show longer analytical chains, and we've got to get evaluative comments in there as well. So it might be that if we're answering a 3 mark question and we can get that done in 2, we could steal some extra time and apportion it over to our 16 to 20 mark questions. Now, before we run you down on the structure, one other thing to discuss is whether we should start our answer off with some definitions. Some teachers advise it, some teachers say no, get straight into the body of your answer. Personally, I would say that you can pick up all of the marks associated with knowledge. You can show the examiner all the knowledge that they're expecting to see through the main body of your answer without having to define key terms such as place or market share at the beginning. However, if your teacher is teaching you to start off with a 1-2 sentence section of definitions right at the beginning of the answer there, go with your teacher's advice. There's no harm in it. It's just less time that you can spend developing those chains of analysis and evaluative comments. Now, let's get going on the basic structure then. So we want to try and construct a 16 to 20 mark question in 3 different parts, 3 different components. And in each of those 3 different components, we're going to be doing something different. We're going to be showing the examiner something different. So in our first section, we want to try and make a strong point. In this question behind us here, we want to try and make a strong point, perhaps in agreement with the statement. So we want to make a point in support of the case that place is now more important than the other aspects of the marketing mix to organisations in the clothing sector like Debenhams and like ASOS. Now, once we've made that point, and it's very, very important to start with a point, I think place is more important than other aspects of the marketing mix for this reason, because of this point. We then want to show the examiners one of our skills. So once we've made our point, what we want to try and do is then give some evidence that that point is accurate, that that is true. In other words, we want to try and apply that point. We want to try and say, okay, I've made this point here, but here's how it relates to the clothing sector. Here's how it relates to retailers. Here's how it relates to firms that have pitched themselves in the position in the market that Debenhams and ASOS have. So here's my point, and I'm now going to apply it. I'm going to try and inject some context into there. Little tip for you. If you've got a nice juicy case study to work with and you can lace your answers not just with elements of application but with bits of data as you go as well, examiners will love seeing data as a source of application. So we've got our point. We've got something to tie it into the organisations in the case study so that we're relating our answer to the case study organisations. We then want to get going on our chain of application. So if this point were true, if this point were to occur, what could be the consequences? And you want to check out our exam skills tutorials on how to do killer analysis if you are still unsure how to develop those chains of analytical impacts. How I would finish your first section is to then link it back to the question. It's so common in exam answers for students to have wandered off topic and lost sight of the question by the time they get to the end of their first point. So at the end of it, return to the question. Try and be evaluative. Examiners will like it if you evaluate throughout your answer rather than just storing it all up for a conclusion. So try and make some judgments. Why does this point answer the question? What is important about this point? What does this point illustrate or show us? Try and show some judgment at the end of that first section. Then we'll move on to section 2, where we really want to switch our roles and counter the points that we've just made. We want to try and talk about a second section that really is in opposition of the question or is bringing in alternative approaches. So for the question behind us here, we might say why place might not be such an important part of the marketing mix for clothing retailers like Debenhams and ASOS. As part of that, we might even bring in other elements of the marketing mix that we feel might be more important, such as the product that's being sold, maybe the prices or pricing strategies that firms are trying to utilize. Maybe we go promotions or one of the more niche elements of the marketing mix, a physical environment, people, processes, something like that. But in our second section, we want to turn away from supporting the statement that's in the question, and we want to try and counter it and give an alternative. Then we run through the same structure in section 2 as we used in section 1. We want to make a point. I don't consider place to possibly be the most important element of the marketing mix for firms like ASOS and Debenhams chasing greater market share for this reason, because of this point. Again, we then want to try and get that into context. We want to try and perhaps use something from the case study to try and link that point to clothing manufacturers, to firms like ASOS, to firms like Debenhams, and maybe getting in there the fact that it might not help them chase market share as well. Then we want to get our chains of impacts going. If we can keep those chains of impact applied again, remember our rule about trying to use data and numbers and figures wherever possible. And then finally, bring that second section back to the question. So I've made a counterpoint here. Maybe I've suggested a second element of the marketing mix that could be more important to ASOS and Debenhams and firms like them, but I'm going to explain the relevance of that point. I'm going to bring it back to the question, why is it important? Why is it a key determinant of chasing greater market share? Then we get to section 3, conclusions. We could talk at length about conclusions. We'll do separate tutorials on how to write A-grade conclusions. But here's what we need in our conclusion. Here's a very quick rundown. Your conclusion must be evaluative. It must answer the question. The very first sentence of your concluding section should be, I think the answer is. Is place the most crucial element of the marketing mix if you're a firm like Debenhams chasing market share, or is it not? Is it something else? Is it another element of the marketing mix? Now, what we want to try and do is show some judgment on what students so often do in their conclusions is they just recap analysis from earlier on in their answer. So if in their first paragraph they were talking about why place is so important if you're chasing market share, why it's more crucial than the other elements of the marketing mix, students may have listed lots of advantages of having an effective place strategy. And in their conclusions, if they're concluding that place is indeed the most important aspect to focus on, they will just recap all of those advantages. But the examiner has already given you the marks for those sentences. Rewriting them a second time is not going to get you the marks. What instead you've got to do is you've got to show judgment. Not what is so good about place in terms of chasing market share, but why is place better in this instance than product, price, promotion, physical environment, people, processes? Why does place win? Not what's good about place, but why is it better than another aspect of the marketing mix that you may have mentioned in your answer. So we don't just recap analysis in those conclusions. We've got to try and show some judgment why one thing defeats another, why one argument prioritizes another. Little tip for you. If we're struggling to think why one argument might outweigh or defeat another, why one point might be stronger or more forceful in this instance than another, you can think about your conclusions another way. Might one option be better in the short term whilst another option might be a better long-term solution? Could we say that place is a better long-term solution to chasing market share because the clothing market is increasingly turning online rather than traditional bricks and mortar stores? So in the long term, we believe that place is the most important aspect of the marketing mix to focus on. But in the shorter term, maybe we could say that something like promotions or prices could be more important. Price, because in this market, consumers at the moment are quite price sensitive, whilst wages in the country are particularly stagnant. Or maybe we could go promotions at the moment because we're moving into a new season in the fashion market, and at the start of each season promotions are particularly important in order to try and capture some market share. But in the longer term, getting that place strategy right as the market moves more online and adopts more e-commerce strategies, maybe in the longer term we could say that place is indeed more important than the other elements. So there's a little rundown of how we try and approach these 16 to 20 mark questions. Look out for our tutorial on 16 to 20 markers, our top 3 tips to get more bits of advice on how to maximize your marks when we're doing business studies answers.